Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Driving the Tide by Lee Jackson. Narrated by Charlie Thurston. Prologue. January 9th, 1944. Isle of Sark, Guernsey Bailiwick, Channel Islands. The Dame of Sark, Marian Littlefield, met the ferry from Guernsey at the dock at Crewe Harbor. As passengers disembarked, German guards checked identification papers and certificates granting permission to travel. Having satisfied the hated bureaucratic requirement, the people proceeded on foot through the rock channel and up the long Harbor Hill Road leading to the plateau 80 feet above sea level. The guards then applied equal diligence as passengers taking the return trip to Guernsey also presented their travel documents. The pattern was well set in this, the fourth year of Nazi occupation. Sark's residents had become accustomed to the annoyance, along with all the other Nazi-imposed irritants that had made life barely tolerable on their island, which, before the Germans had arrived, they had described as a little piece of paradise. Marian searched the crowd for a particular man, but she could not do so overtly or she would certainly draw unwanted attention. For the man, such attention could prove fatal. His name was Joseph Wackley, and he carried 3 pieces of paper folded tightly together and concealed in the heel of his shoe. Under normal times, the papers would be considered innocuous, not anything that would bring officialdom to exact the death of the messenger. However, these were not normal times, and Wackley's 3 sheets of fine paper comprised the latest edition of the Guernsey Underground News Service, better known as Guns among its readers. The newsletter, for it could hardly be termed a newspaper, was published by Charles Machon on Guernsey. He was a linotype operator of the Guernsey Star, and his papers were surreptitiously distributed across Guernsey to select subscribers. They were then carried by secret courier to Sark and Jersey, where they were further dispersed. In the case of Sark, the distributor was Hubert Lanyon, who ran the local bakery and general merchandise shop. Normally, Lanyon would have gone to the wharf himself to retrieve the courier and the 3 sheets of compromising paper. But this morning he had sent his son to ask Marian if she would do the honors. He had taken ill and did not entrust to just anyone the safe transfer of the newsletter from the courier to his shop. His son, a young boy, had knocked on Marian's door and said, "My father asked if you could do his normal weekly chore." Marian had immediately sent the lad back with a message that she would be happy to oblige, and thus she now searched the crowd unobtrusively for Wackley. In her mid-50s, she was the recognized ruler of Sark, under the only remaining feudal system in the Western world, and she was very thin due to the deprivations of German occupation. Her husband Stephen was an American by birth and a naturalized British citizen. If he were present, he would be senior co-ruler under the medieval precept of right of wife. Instead, he was interned at Ilog 7 at Titmoning Castle, Laufen, Bavaria, for having been a commissioned officer in the Royal Air Force during World War I. Despite her position, Marian had endeared herself to her fellow citizens, and they had, to a person, stayed on the island because she had asked them to do so in the interest of saving their culture when the German blight finally ended. She had not foreseen how bad things would become. Insufficient food, children without milk, scarce medical care, teeth falling out of people's mouths for lack of proper vitamins. A German mandate required all residents to surrender their radios under penalty of death. A few, including Marian herself, still had some hidden away, but electricity had become sporadic, and the possibility loomed that they would have neither lights nor the ability to hear news from the outside world. Hence the Guernsey Underground News Service, the largest and most widely distributed of several such illicit newsletters, had become sought after, hungered for, and the recipients were always mindful of the penalty for being found with a copy. Having spotted Wackley, Marian approached him indirectly, first making quick eye contact, then moving closer and pretending to be surprised to see him. The guards, knowing her by sight due to her stature on the island and the respect she had demanded and received from their superiors over the long occupation, were careful not to interfere in her conversations. She, however, took every precaution.
"Ah, Mr. Wackley, how nice to see you. What a surprise. Are you here for the day, or will you be staying longer?"
"Just enough time to pop in at Hubert Lanyon's shop to pick up an order."
"Oh dear, I'm afraid he's taken ill and might not be there. I'm going that way. I came down to see some friends off, and then I'll be happy to walk with you to his shop. We can catch up on things."
Wackley accepted the invitation affably, waited patiently with Marian as she bid farewell to departing passengers, and then walked with her out of the harbor. "I don't understand why Hubert sent you all the way to the wharf," he said when they were well into the shadow of the tunnel.
"Just an overabundance of caution. I don't mind. I needed the fresh air and the exercise. Where do you carry guns?"
"In the heel of my left shoe." Marian laughed.
"Then I suppose we should wait until we're inside Lanyon's bakery. Getting it from you here might raise questions."
Once inside the shop, Wackley removed his shoe, pried off the heel, extracted the 3 sheets of paper, and handed them to Marian. She scanned them, then remarked with a touch of sarcasm,
"And for this, our lives could be forfeit."
1. January 17th, 1944. Southwest of Monte Cassino, Italy. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Littlefield plugged his ears with 2 fingers as a BL 55-inch field artillery gun a few yards away launched an ear-splitting projectile over a long, wide field and across the Rapido River. It targeted a German troop position in Castelforte, a village spilling from the foothills of a mountain in the Apennine Range onto flatter ground stretching 1,000 yards to the river's north bank. The gun's piercing concussion shook the ground as its barrel spewed fire and lurched upward before it settled in a cloud of dust on its large rubber tires. Paul watched the crew as a soldier yanked open the breech and let the brass casing fall out. 2 more men, sweating under the heavy load of the next projectile on a canvas cradle between them, manhandled the round into the tube, while the 3rd man shoved it into the chamber with a long rammer. Yet another tossed in several small packets of propellant, while a 5th set the charge. The 1st man slammed the breech shut, grabbed the lanyard, and glanced at the battery commander standing a few feet away. The officer dropped his hand and yelled, "Fire!" With only seconds having passed since the previous salvo, the gunner pulled the lanyard. Flame belched in concert with a line of identical artillery guns, all aimed toward the tiny village 3 miles away. The ground trembled and the air exploded with terrible thunder. The heavy guns bounced into the air from the force of their launches, and they settled down amid acrid swirls of gun smoke and dust. The crews hurried through their actions for the next barrage. Paul shifted his attention to watch the inevitable eruptions of dirt and debris that would arise from Castelforte. As his eyes swept past the gun, 2 clucking chickens with wings flapping scurried between him and the gun crews. Then, on a road just feet in front of the upward slanting barrel of the artillery piece, Paul caught sight of a bent, swarthy man in wrinkled clothing and a worn-out fedora, leading a firewood-laden donkey. The 2 paused momentarily. The man stared vacantly at the gun and crew, and then proceeded past them. Paul shook his head at the incongruity of the scene. The sound of dull thuds followed by the blast of bursting shells reverberated his attention to Castelforte. Smoke blanketed the town against the backdrop of the mountains. A wave of revulsion overtook him as images flashed through his mind of many such villages the Allied armies had entered and left in desolation as they pursued the Wehrmacht north. He had tried to imagine how the hamlets had appeared before the Germans and the Allies had clashed on their way through them. Even under winter's gray skies, the beauty of the landscape along the route to the Gustav line could not be hidden, but it was stained by ruin. Such would also be the lot of Castelforte. The Wehrmacht's high command had obviously mandated the scorched earth policy as it orchestrated an orderly withdrawal up the Italian boot, destroying anything that could be useful to the pursuing Allied army, which was being aided by an active popular resistance. The slow-moving battle meant the destruction of roads, bridges, railroad tracks, factories, power plants, and even dwellings and shops. Much of what remained was destroyed by the Allied armies fighting their way north to Rome. A recurring image flashed across Paul's mind, one he struggled to blot out. of entering a blighted unknown village and finding the shrapnel-pierced body of a little girl. She was alone, her lifeless hands clutching a rag doll as her home smoldered beneath her. She had lain so still, her face frozen in fear, her eyes staring, her cheeks stained from tears crusted by fine dust, the residue of falling bombs. He had picked her up tenderly and carried her to the edge of the village where partisans gathered their dead for burial, and he had stayed with her until her tiny body had been interred. Then he had knelt over her grave, his throat constricted as tears forced their way from his eyes. Since the amphibious landing at Salerno nearly 5 months earlier, the infantry battalion he commanded as part of the British 10th Corps attached to U.S. General Clark's 5th Army had battled its way 50 miles northwest over freezing peaks and valleys burned into wastelands. Trees lining the roads were bereft of leaves and blackened by fire. Crop fields lay desolate. Foot soldiers plodded through thick muck or pushed jeeps along roads that had been churned into knee-deep mud by heavy war machines under constant rain. During rest breaks, the men huddled in the drizzle beneath their helmets and ponchos to enjoy a cigarette, read a letter from home, or try to boil water for tea in their tin canteen cups over tiny fires. Combat in the mountains had been the worst. To reach the summit, soldiers trudged in a line a third of the way up the rugged slopes alongside long lines of supplies-laden mules. From that point, the terrain was too uneven and jagged for the animals' hooves, so the soldiers lugged the provisions on their backs up the remaining distance to the craggy cliffs, often returning multiple times for more loads. Paul recalled the first time he had made such a trip. He had trekked up Monte Sammucro with the battalion he commanded, the first of the Queen's Brigade after the Germans had been dislodged from their positions overlooking the town of San Pietro. He had been exhausted on reaching the summit in the middle of the night, his lungs heaving for more oxygen. Then, as dawn spread across the misty crest, he had been aghast at the sight of wan soldiers hunched into the crevices along the summit. Visibly worn down by freezing temperatures, inadequately protected by their uniforms, shocked by frequent German artillery shelling and raids, underfed and gripping their tin canteen cups for the warmth of tea at every opportunity, they maintained remarkable spirits. They rose to attack when ordered, or to defend when the enemy assaulted, and they took turns trudging down the rugged mountainside to meet the mule lines and lug supplies back up to the crest. The pattern had been set. The Germans initially occupied key high ground and villages. The Allied forces bombed, strafed, shelled, and frontally attacked with infantry and tanks until the enemy retreated to the next village or mountaintop northward on the Italian peninsula toward Rome, leaving desolation in their wake. Such had been the case with the village where Paul had buried the little girl, and such was now unfolding in Castelforte. The campaign to take Monte Cassino had started 6 days ago, when, before dawn, the French Expeditionary Corps, consisting of the 3rd Algerian and 2nd Moroccan Divisions, assaulted the Wehrmacht 5th Mountain Division on the Allied right flank in a fierce battle to the northeast of the Benedictine monastery on the crest of Monte Cassino. The German positions were annihilated by the Arabs, who used great stealth to approach their targets and attacked with knives and swords. However, as the battle developed, the German division was replaced with the 3rd Panzergrenadiers, a mechanized enemy unit. It held off the expeditionary force from its major objective at Atina, and then reconcentrated its field artillery on the center of the battlefield. Paul knew those guns were now aimed toward a bend in the Garigliano River in front of strong German defenses where the U.S. 36th Infantry Division would launch a river crossing simultaneous with his own attack across the Rapido. His face set hard with the knowledge of what was to come in his sector on the Allied left flank to the southwest of Monte Cassino. He turned and strode to the farmhouse 25 yards behind the guns that served as the battery's observation post. Ducking his head through the door, he called to an officer in front of a large field map peering out a window through binoculars toward Castelforte. "I'll be rejoining my battalion now," he said. The officer lowered the binoculars and nodded at Paul. "Good luck. We'll see you on the other side of the river." Paul glanced at his watch in the dark. The smaller of the two luminescent hands pointed to 9, the larger to 12. At that moment he heard a solitary muffled poof, a break in the air barely audible. A small red orb arced across the star-strewn sky. It floated past his position, over the river, and landed in enemy territory, signaling the start of the Allied assault. The guns by the farmhouse, now far to his rear, thundered. They were joined by 500 others of many calibers in a line extending east and west. Their projectiles hissed as they flew far above Paul's head and detonated across the river with dull thuds, creating a thick smoke screen. Their fire lit up the southeastern sky. Paul turned to his signaler and uttered a single word into his radio mic. "Move." Unseen to his left and right, soldiers of 3 infantry companies, nearly 300 men, crept through the wet grass and mud toward the Garigliano River. Beyond them to his right, an adjacent battalion of the Queen's Brigade maneuvered toward the river. Behind him, a battalion remained in reserve. Far off to Paul's left, the foot soldiers of the 167 Brigade moved forward on line. The mass of units swept across the fields to the Garigliano's near bank and entered the frigid, fast-flowing waters, while German 88mm guns rained down heavy fire. On the south bank, a British mortar platoon returned salvo after salvo. The staccato of machine guns and the crackling of rifles resounded, their bullets kicking up small fountains in the river. Flares cast a ghostly light, revealing horrifying details of soldiers wading into the fast-moving stream in the face of merciless fusillades. Paul reached the south bank and peered through the orange half-light. Large groups of men had waded partway across the open expanse of water from 50 to 100 yards wide. Other soldiers launched small rubber boats laden with more soldiers and ammunition, and engineer teams had begun constructing Bailey pontoon bridges for the tanks that would follow. The unrelenting deluge of lethal fire continued, with thousands of artillery rounds finding their marks. They left large pits in the ground that soldiers clambered through, burdened by their heavy equipment after navigating the river and climbing up its bank. Already bodies floated in the fast-flowing river amid dark swirls of blood. Desperate cries of the wounded punctuated intermittent interruptions of gunfire. Fortunately, the climb out of the river had not been difficult in Paul's sector, but his battalion was slowed by gunfire. He anticipated that the enemy would seek only to delay the British advance there, and that his troops would thus meet comparatively light resistance on the expanse of flat ground above Garigliano's north bank. Nevertheless, between the relentless fire of artillery, machine guns, and rifles as the battalion advanced through the muddy terrain and barbed wire obstacles, the unit took steady casualties. Paul grimaced as he contemplated that his soldiers would encounter even more punishment when they reached the base of the foothills. Then the Germans would open a blistering defense intended to mow down the infantry. The troops pressed on, and before morning's first light, they had secured San Lorenzo, which lay across the road to Castelforte. Paul established his headquarters on the upstairs floor of a farmhouse midway across the open fields. The way east out of San Lorenzo skirted the foothills and intersected 2 parallel roads leading up into Castelforte. Overlooking both villages, Monte Damiano rose into the heavens, providing its German occupiers clear views of the lower approaches and deadly fields of fire against the British attack. German artillery rounds ranged in front of and behind the rambling 2-story farmhouse, and then zeroed in on it. A dispatcher rider approached Paul. "I have a message from Brigade," he said. Just then, a loud shriek split the air, and deafening explosions shook the house. Dust and smoke swirled, plaster fell from the walls, bits of cement flew through the air, but the sturdy stone walls withstood a direct artillery hit and then another. "I have orders," the rider gasped amid the clearing dust when the shelling abated. He produced a small map of the area. "The radio traffic to headquarters is coming in garbled. You're to reposition your units farther northeast along this line." He indicated the position to Paul. Paul stared aghast. "That makes no sense. My companies will execute the main attack into Castelforte. To get to that position, we'll have to cross in front of friendly units, expose our left flank, and attack from the worst position. Sorry, sir. These are your orders. Paul set his jaw. We'll have to confirm. Just then, another officer coughed his way through the dust. I say, I'm looking for a runner from division headquarters. Reading Paul's skeptical look, he said, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Green. He extended his hand to Paul. I've just taken over command of 167 Brigade. I'm afraid my boss caught a fatal round to the temple on the way in. We're setting up headquarters just downstairs. Paul whirled on the courier. Which unit are you carrying orders for? Looking chagrined, the soldier replied, The 167, sir. Wrong unit, Paul growled testily. Sensing the tension, Green cut in. Not his fault, he told Paul. I had sent a runner to inform division that I would come here to set up my headquarters pending the next advance. That message was for me. Paul chuckled wryly and rubbed his face wearily. I did the same thing. My runner should be arriving at my brigade HQ about now. We'll have to operate carefully, Green said with a tinge of frustration. On the way up here, I passed through another battalion headquarters setting up downstairs. The fog of war, Paul muttered. This misdirected message almost created a major calamity. The silver lining is that you and I can coordinate directly. My battalion will spearhead the attack into Castelforte. We'll protect your left flank and move it behind you when you've secured the village. Green paused and surveyed the ground to the north through a window, and then continued with a note of sarcasm. Higher headquarters thinks this village is a minor aim. The major objective is the high ground around St. Benedict Monastery on top of Monte Cassino. But we cannot bomb or otherwise damage the abbey. Paul nodded with a sigh. It's 14 centuries old. Even the Jerrys respect its historic value. He glanced out the window. But they must be using the ground around it for observation, and they're well dug in down here. Tanks, tank destroyers, and masses of infantry are hunkered down nearby, and their artillery is relentless. Minor or not, seizing Castelforte will be a hellacious fight. 2. Same day. Bletchley Park, England. Claire Littlefield stood in front of her accustomed seat before the desk of Commander Edward Travis in his office at the British Intelligence Centre housed in the sprawling Bletchley Park estate. The main task there was decoding and analyzing enemy wireless messages. Travis motioned for Claire to sit down while he finished a call. And then he hung up on the phone and turned to her. We didn't get to Rome by Christmas last year as hoped, he said. But at least the Italians are our co-belligerents now. Not quite the same status as allies, but it'll have to do. At least they're not fighting against us. What are you hearing about them out of Berlin? Italy is a hellish front, as you know, sir. The weather bogged our troops in mud, so we didn't make nearly the progress we had planned for. The Germans won't concede that front easily, as indicated by orders going out from their high command to the field. Recall that Erwin Rommel, among others, urged Hitler to abandon southern Italy and mass troops in the Po Valley in northern Italy in preparation for an all-out defense of Germany against an Allied invasion. But Field Marshal Kesselring advised Hitler to stay and wear down the Allies fighting up Italy's boot. The Führer took the latter advice. Claire's once ready smile still flashed frequently, but her countenance was guarded, her brown eyes possessing a practiced, neutral expression. Bletchley Park was among Britain's most secret intelligence assets, a facility able to intercept and decode Germany's highest classified transmissions almost as fast as they were sent. Claire led one of the decoding and analysis teams, whose specific task was to monitor wireless traffic coming out of the German High Command in Berlin. The oath of secrecy that Claire and everyone working at Bletchley had sworn was onerous, requiring under penalty of death that not even families or close friends could know the work being done there. Claire and her associates accepted the prohibition and abided by it without protest, knowing the potential consequence of the enemy learning of its existence and capabilities. Among Bletchley's contributions was supplying intelligence that led to locating and sinking the battleship Bismarck, which had threatened the British fleet in the Atlantic, and providing communiques between the German High Command and Field Marshal Rommel in North Africa, such that British ground commanders knew Rommel's orders almost as soon as he did. Claire's fluency with the German language and her analytical prowess had brought her abilities to the attention of her superiors. She had distinguished herself in several intelligence coups, including taking the lead in locating the Bismarck, and she had thus been promoted to head a team of decoders and analysts. Travis leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into a studious expression behind large spectacles. "I questioned the wisdom of going into Italy. It's built for defense." He shook his head in serious incredulity. "With all the Apennine Mountains forming its spine and all the subsidiary ranges running from them to both sides of the peninsula, it's a veritable fortress. Throw in the rivers and streams that flow from the mountain heights to either the Tyrrhenian or Adriatic seas, and it becomes all but impenetrable." Raising his eyebrows in a jocular fashion, he added, "Perhaps that's why God put the Vatican there." Claire nodded.
"The terrain in the Po is flat. It allows flexibility to move troops quickly eastward toward Venice, to defend incursions coming out of the Balkans into southern Austria, or to go west toward Milan and meet an invasion of southern France. The Alps in the north prevent a direct Allied frontal assault through Switzerland. So, if we gained the Po Valley, we would be in position to bomb Austria and southern Germany. But to get to it, we have to go through all those natural barriers you mentioned. Our troops were never equipped for that, nor were the Americans. The saving grace is that neither were the Germans. The fact is that we have two opposing armies fighting in the mountains and valleys of an Italian winter, with no cold weather equipment. In some cases, not even gloves."
Travis grunted while he contemplated. "Refresh my memory," he broke in after a moment. "Why didn't the Germans follow Rommel's advice? It would have saved them and us a bloodbath coming up Italy's boot."
Claire took a moment to gather her thoughts. "Kesselring advised that the Wehrmacht should defend fiercely at various lines farther south in Italy, engage in attrition there. He convinced Hitler to use the mountains as natural barriers and firing points, and to reinforce heavily where needed. He argued that doing so would exhaust Allied soldiers and their morale, kill thousands of them, use up our supplies, wear out our equipment, and buy time to harden their homeland defenses. He also wanted time to complete development of some of their experimental weapons."
"Like the atomic bomb," Travis said gravely.
"Yes, sir. And their rockets and pilotless bombs."
Travis nodded. "The V1s and V2s. He sighed. "Our bombing raid over Peenemünde bought us time to deal with those, but not nearly enough. We knocked out production facilities and some of the scientific community that was developing them, but we didn't deliver a death blow. When those weapons are fully developed and in production, our people will suffer more terror from the skies." Remembering the carnage in London and other British cities during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, the two contemplated the horrific thought in silence. Then Travis cleared his throat. "Is your brother Paul still in Italy?" Claire nodded stoically, managing to stem the emotion that so often rose unbidden for the loss of loved ones and the rubble of homes across the UK caused by countless Luftwaffe bombing sweeps.
"Yes, sir," she sniffed. "The last I heard, he was as safe as is possible while fighting at the front."
"Is he still commanding an infantry battalion?"
"That's my latest information."
"How are your other brothers, Lance and Jeremy? Do you hear from them?"
Claire nodded. "I'm afraid Lance is stuck in a German POW camp for the duration. Allied orders are going out to our captured men to terminate escape plans."
"I've heard that. Escaping POWs could interfere with resistance efforts needed to support invasion operations."
Claire chuckled ruefully. "That'll rankle Lance to no end. He's not one to sit still and wait out anything.
Travis laughed gently with her.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?